agree on that. So today we're coming to Aristotle. I have put up here 3 little statements. I'm not going to explain them, but I do want you to write them down. And situations like this always kind of remind me of that program I used to watch when I was much younger called Kung Fu. Remember that? Anybody remember that show? Because it's way before your time. But the star of the show, I think David Carradine or was his name or something like that, he was in this Kung Fu temple learning. And the master said to him, when you can take the little, whatever it was, pea or marble or what was it, he had something in his hand, then you will be ready to leave. Remember that famous scene? Every episode, it would always start with that. And then one day, he does this fabulous kung fu move on his master, and bang, he's got the pea right in his hand there, So then he's free to leave. And his adventures begin then. Well, I always kind of feel that way at times like this. I'm not going to explain these 3 statements to you, but when you can explain them to me, then you will be free to move on to the next topic in philosophy. So anyway, Aristotle is responding to, reacting to some degree, Plato, his great master. And he stands in opposition to Plato along these lines. Scientific rather than metaphysical. Observation rather than intuition. Causation rather than valuation. You see, what I'm likely to do one of these days is just ask you, say in a test situation, to explain those to me. I'm kind of letting the cat out of the bag here a little bit, Stephen, but you're the only one listening right now, so you're the only one that's going to get the benefit of it, So anyway, I'm not going to try to explain them further, but as we go along, hopefully the distinctions will become a little more clear. And you already have some sense, even now, of what is being stated. So write those down, think about them as we proceed. You tell me, what do you know about Aristotle? You've certainly heard of him. You've read quite a bit of his writings in various classes up to this point. So, quick sketch. Who in the world is this guy? Just off the top of your head, tell me the first 2 or 3 things that come to mind connected to Aristotle.
That he was a Greek philosopher.
He was a Greek philosopher. Good start. Yeah. He was a student of Plato.
We read most of his rhetoric.
You've read his rhetoric in rhetoric.
So he was definitely.
You've also read most of his blank in blank. We read something in here. Pardon?
We read something like in civics.
Civics. Yes, dear. And what did we read in civics? Please, warm my heart. Make me happy. Make my day. I don't remember the name. What did we read? What do we read in civics? We read most or a lot of Aristotle's, Jacob? Politics. Okay. And you have probably read a little bit of Aristotle elsewhere in other courses. So aside from what has just been put on the table by Laura with a little help from Jacob, what else do you know about Aristotle? Any other tidbits, trivia come to mind? Anybody? Trevor? Anything else that kind of is common knowledge about Aristotle?
I think that his ideas were the basis for geocentrism.
All right, good. He was really the one who gave rise, although it was around earlier, but he really formulated what we call geocentric cosmology, right? Mm-hmm.
Was he at all involved with Alexander the Great?
Yes. Very good. What was the connection between Aristotle and Alexander the Great? Do you know what the connection was? He taught him, exactly. So he was a tutor for 2 or 3 years to the greatest conqueror in the history of the world to that time. Anything else? Any other little trivia? Avery, anything else pop to mind there? Josiah, go ahead.
I know his idea about matter has influenced the Catholic understanding of
excellent. Can you say any more about that, Josiah, than that? Which is correct.
I think he talked about how matter has like an essence and how it has like characteristics but also has an essence. And I think the Catholics kind of take the idea that during communion, the Eucharist, that the bread and wine can actually become in essence.
Okay, that's right. Transubstantiation, the substance changes, but the accidents remains the same. That's an Aristotelian distinction. Anything else? Those are good. Good. I'm pleased. Matthew, anything else? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Those are all points we will try to string together as we go along, like little pearls on a string. Just a little bit of bio, so you should know this. This is not much, but helps to know a little bit of the bio. He was born in 384. Born in 384 in Macedon. Where is Macedon? I have a quite irrelevant map here, but it does happen to have what was once Macedon on it. So where is Macedon? Jacob?
North of Greece.
North of, oh, okay, so you made it easy. It's right here. Okay, I was going to make you run the pen game, but you went right to it. Macedon is this region. I'm circling a much larger region, but it's kind of an area north of Greece. Many people consider it part of Greece, but it wasn't. In the ancient world, the Greeks considered themselves much more sophisticated. The Macedonians were kind of like the backwoods Neanderthals. You know, they were viewed as rude, unsophisticated, swinging from vines and trees by the Greek standards. But that all kind of changed when Aristotle came along. Anyway, he was born in 384. His father was a physician. His father was the court physician to the father of Alexander the Great, whose name was, the father of Alexander the Great was named Matthew. Be brave.
Is it Philip?
Very good. Philip, which number? Okay. That's good. Philip, number, do you know, Sydney?
I think it's number 2.
2. Due. Philip II. So remember, the Philip II is the father of Alexander the Great. And Aristotle's father, a guy by the name of Nicomachus, hence Nicomachean Ethics, which is one of the writings of Aristotle, dedicated to his father, was a court physician. He was the MD, you might say. At the age of 18, Aristotle, as a young man about your age, in fact, in some cases, your age, was sent by his father to kind of the center of the academic universe, which happened to be about 100 miles south from Macedonia down to Athens, where the most famous teacher in the world was running his school, and that most famous teacher and that school were, respectively, Alicia?
Plato at the Academy.
That's right, Plato and the Oaks. We are. And so there he was in the academy, and so this was considered to be the finest education you could get. And so off Alexander goes to be educated at the feet of the now quite famous and well-known and highly respected Plato. Yeah.
So, working as Philip II's doctor, he was very wealthy for the time, correct?
Oh, yeah. He was well off. Aristotle did so well that Plato just kept him on. So after he had gone through the basic curriculum, Plato said, stick around, I got a job for you, you know. So it's something like Miss Miller, you know, Allegra Miller, who was so brilliant here as a student that we just said, come on back, you know. Now she's teaching. So it may happen in your life too. I'm getting old. I'm going to be replaced pretty soon. You know, somebody want my job? Hey, you know, just kind of your opportunity may be coming. So anyway, Aristotle sticks around and stays at the academy then for from his 18th year to his 37th year. So this was the young adulthood of Aristotle. They had Many people think that they didn't get along, that they were constantly in conflict. That is not true. They had the highest regard for one another. They had a huge amount of respect for each other, but they did differ. And in some ways, it was the difference between them that made life at the academy so juicy. You know, if everybody all says the same thing, it's the party line, everybody agrees, there's nothing where we can debate, then what fun is that? You've got to have something where you can kind of tangle with each other. And when Aristotle and Plato would tangle, wrestle intellectually, then the students, of course, got the benefit of that. That was really, very much to their educational help. There's a very famous painting, Renaissance painting, that tries to capture that difference. It's simply called The Academy. And who painted it? Can anyone describe it, Ben?
It's painted by Raphael.
Mm-hmm. And what is it? Do you remember the kind of what it looks like?
Well, it's got tons of people hanging out, and there's Aristotle and Plato
Yeah.
there.
Okay. That's good. Y'all familiar with that? What's the difference between Plato and Aristotle and their posture, as Raphael depicts it in that painting? Anybody, Krista?
Plato is pointing upwards, and then Aristotle has a book.
No, not a book, but you're right, half right. Plato's pointing up. He's the old man, gray hair, pointing up. And Aristotle, the young man, is pictured, what's his posture? What's that? Close, Mrs. Van Kara. Yeah, it's out, 4 fingers out, like that. So you've got the two of them in this conflict, and Raphael captures the difference. Because Plato calls us upward, right? He calls us up to the ideal world, the perfections, that inward quest through intuition to get to ultimate truth, not by examining nature, but by examining your soul. He's a rationalist. Aristotle's a scientist. Science has to do with particulars, 4 fingers pointing out, not 1 finger pointing up. Universal, particular. You get the difference? Particular trees, particular squirrels, particular ants and grasshoppers and students at the Oaks and all of this. It's particulars, not universals. Yes?
Is it possible that the 4 fingers represent the 4 elements?
That's an intriguing hypothesis that I have never heard before till you, young man, said it. Have you ever heard that? Is that unique to you? I don't know. You might want to explore that. Maybe you should go and get a PhD in art history, write your thesis, and come and bring it back to me so I'll be able to address that. But I don't know. I've never heard that before. It's an interesting thought. Interesting thought. All right. So anyway, that's what's going on. So really, life at the academy was a lot of fun. And the students, some of them sided with Aristotle, some sided with Plato, but in any event, it was a great camaraderie that they had, and I think Plato appreciated the alternative emphasis from Aristotle. However, in 347, everything changed because Plato died. And so the great master was gone. Aristotle expected, in fact, Aristotle rather took it for granted that Plato was going to bequeath the academy to Aristotle. That he would be, he was the obvious successor. There's nobody even close to him in his intellectual horsepower. And so Aristotle was quite upset, disappointed, and angered when Plato actually willed the school to another famous guy you've all heard of, Zufrius. You know that name, don't you? Good old Zufrius. One of those household names, you just hear about him all the time. And I don't want to spell it because you don't need to know it. It does not matter, and I will never test you on who did Plato will the academy to. But just for if you're ever on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and it's the $1 million question, that could be the question, So, Zufrius, yeah.
Because Plato's goal was trying to make everybody see the world of the forms, Wouldn't he have thought that Aristotle was getting in the way by posing?
Yeah, but sure, and Plato disagreed with Aristotle, but he felt that when the two of them got together and argued, Plato always thought he won. So he thought, it's just helping me make my case. Of course, Aristotle always thought he won. And, some students agreed with one, some with the other. But, no, Plato was an academic. He loved you read his dialogues, and you realize that these are dialogues. These are conversations, many times intricate debates. He liked that, so he wasn't too troubled by that. All right, well, Aristotle was so upset that he quit. When he found out that Zufrius was going to take over, he just said, I'm out of here, enough of this nonsense. And so he takes off and travels for about 5 years. This is in 347. This is when he married. We know zero about his wife. But he did marry and traveled around and kind of, did what rich, younger, middle-aged guys do. They just kind of go out there and hang out in the Aegean. So that's what he did. However, in 342, Aristotle was summoned by Philip II, who of course knew him, had known him since he was an infant, to come and be the tutor, not just to Alexander, but to the children of the royal court. And so Aristotle probably had half a dozen children that he was educating there. But of course the most conspicuous was Alexander. Alexander was about 13. It'd be like 13, 14, 15, junior high age, roughly. In 335, well, you should know this history. I'm just reminding you of it. In 336, Philip II was assassinated. Remember that? You all know that, don't you? Just nod your head affirmatively. There you go. 336, Philip II was assassinated. Some people thought Alexander was behind it. History remains somewhat oblique on that point. I kind of doubt it personally. I think he had too much regard for his father to have assassinated him, but there's arguments both ways. It's a somewhat intricate problem because Aristotle was actually born of, Alexander was born of Olympias, who was a foreign wife who'd been married by Philip, and there was all kinds of intrigue connected with that. But be that as it may, Philip dies. Philip was planning, you may recall, an attack against Persia. Philip wanted to sock them back for what they had done in the Second Persian War many years earlier, right? But now Philip's dead. So Alexander decides to pick up the mantle, and he launches his famous campaign in about 335, 334, sweeping the known world, right? So he comes out of Greece, he sweeps across Turkey, down into Egypt, over into Babylonia, over into India, and you're familiar with the whole campaign of Alexander. All during those years, I see you, Trevor, all during those years, Alexander is back in Athens. So when Alexander launched his campaign, Aristotle, I may have misspoke there, Aristotle went back to Athens and established his school in Athens, which is called the This is a new school. Trevor, what was your question?
Well, I was wondering whether Alexander the Great ever conquered Greece, or did he just have in mind?
Oh, he did, yeah.
Okay.
There was a raft of rebellions, largely inspired by Themistocles. Demosthenes, right? Demosthenes, the great orator of Athens, who gave his speeches that were called Philippics, anti-Philip speeches. And when Philip died, a lot of Greece revolted. And Alexander, the first thing he did was go down and put down those revolts. It didn't take him long to do it. Anybody know the name of Aristotle's school? Stephen, I see your hand. God, what was your question?
I was wondering, did Aristotle teach Alexander about like warfare, or was he just like naturally, or in general?
Alexander was trained in warfare, but I don't think it was from Aristotle. I think it was from standard education that he received otherwise. What Aristotle gave him was more what you'd call philosophy and the sciences and so on. All right, the name of Aristotle's school, you should know this, another little bit of trivia that should be in your minds and in your notes, the Lyceum, L-Y-C-E, Lyceum. So you got two schools now in Athens. You've got the Academy, Plato, and the Lyceum, Aristotle. There was always a little bit of anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens. Remember, even though Macedon has become very, very powerful, they still view them as a little bit backwards. Even with Aristotle in town, the Macedonians are viewed sort of like these people from the hills. And you still have this bias, and you also have a resentment in the Athenians that they're being dominated by the Macedonians. And so even though they aren't in a position to revolt, they always have this kind of seething undercurrent of we don't like them very much going on. And when Alexander died in the year see, I've tested all of you on this once upon a time, way back when. You all got it right. Trevor, Alexander the Great died in the year?
325.
Oh, so close, so close. Josiah?
I think it was 323.
Right, 323. 323, Alexander dies, and all of a sudden this resentment against the Macedonians erupts because all of a sudden the pressure's off for a moment. Alexander's dead, Macedon is vulnerable, and the Athenian Greeks revolt, and Aristotle is feeling the heat because he's a Macedonian. And he leaves town. And his words, his parting words as he departs Athens were, this is trivia. You learned this once. I don't know, does anybody remember it? I touched this just in passing in Bible context. It's one of the great moments in history. Aristotle leaves town, and his parting words were, anybody? No? What's that? A little sarcastic remark right there? Krista, you want to talk to, go ahead and give your line once again to Jordan. He needs to. He says this, I wanted to prevent the Athenians from sinning twice. Isn't that good? Avery, can you construe that? Why? What was the significance of that?
Well, he was afraid that he would be put to death as well, like Socrates.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Socrates, by this time, was a saint in Athens. He was and the fact that he had been put to death had been universally viewed as a great embarrassment to the Athenians. They now remembered him with great warm affection and deplored the fact that they had executed him those years back. But now Aristotle kind of sees the handwriting on the wall. They might do the same thing to him. So to keep them from committing the same sin twice, Aristotle leaves. Unfortunately, Aristotle died 1 year later. So that's the end of the story. All right. So a sketch of Aristotle's life puts him in some kind of a context. Let me, just for a moment, give you, there's so many ways to approach Aristotle, and I've probably done it a little different every year. So this is my, 8th attempt. We're going to walk through a different door this time, see how this works. But I'd like to start by just giving you a rough kind of sketch of his writings, the classes of his writings. Most Aristotelian scholars would say that the writings of Aristotle can be organized into 4 different broad categories. So let's get these up here. The first of these he calls the organon. And the organon would have generally to do with what? Aristotle would probably disagree and say that this is not a class. This is the preface to his writings. This is like what you need to look at before you look at his writings, you know. But most scholars will include it as one. So what is the organon? What do you suppose that's dealing with? What do you think? Spencer?
Maybe the origins of the world.
Very nice thought, yeah. You're trying to think of this word organon and what English words it may be connected with, and your thought is very good, but not quite right. But you're thinking the right way. It may be, Jordan, what? Do my best to keep you awake in here, you know. I got the glazed eyes there. Organon. What English word is pretty close to the word organon? What comes to mind?
Organ.
That's right. There's another word that is based on the word organ, which is same root, so you're quite correct. And it would give a little more help to understanding this, but that's good. What other word do we have in the English language that starts with organ and finishes with? Organic. It's good. Good start. We're on our way.
Organization.
Organization. They're all related. And from Aristotle's point of view, this was the point where he talks about not particular sciences, but the science of science. Okay? Now that may seem like a strange thing to say, but think about it. You realize that before you can do science, you have to ask, what is science itself? What are we trying to do? What does it mean to do science? So what is the science of science? Not the science of biology or the science of astronomy, but the science of the scientific enterprise itself. What is it about? And this is where he works out all kinds of rules related to, the main things you tie with this are, first of all, the rules of classification. How do we put things in classes? How do we say that this thing goes with that thing, and we call it by a predicate that is given a name that includes these and excludes those? And he probably does as certainly the most penetrating analysis of that had ever been done, and it has continued to be basic to the study of logic ever since. He talks about the rules of logic, the laws of contradiction, so on. A lot of the things that when you studied logic here, 8th grade? Is that when you do logic? You're really studying Aristotelian rules of logic. I don't know if you were told that then, but it's really become basic to the whole study of logic. Debate, fallacies, types of fallacies, formal fallacies, informal fallacies, syllogism, deductive, inductive, all of that is Aristotelian. Some people say Aristotle invented logic. I don't think so. But he did discover it. In many ways, logic was always there, but it took Aristotle to really formulate the rules, the canons, if you will, of logic, of organization. And so before he tackles any of the sciences that he goes after, he wants to tell us what are the rules by which he is going to play, and that's the organon. Yeah.
I was writing when you first introduced this. Is this the 4 categories
of his writings? Yeah. And thus of his thought. When we say it's his writings, it's also, of course, his thought. Let me say something in defense of Aristotle. Some people think when you read Aristotle, he is so deadly boring they can't even believe how stultifying to the brain it is to read Aristotle. Aristotle wasn't that bad a writer. He wasn't as good as Plato, but Plato wrote all his own stuff. But a lot of what we have from Aristotle, this is quite important, is not Aristotle's writing. It is notes. What is this knowing look over here? Avery? Or?
Recall what you were going to say.
Good, let's hear it. You beat me to it. That's great. What?
They're all notes from students.
That's right, lecture notes. And so it'd be very much like, I give these wonderful lectures. You all have to agree. They're just, And Matthew, 50 years from now, pulls out the kind of the dusty notes that he had from philosophy in high school, and he tries to write them down. And somebody goes, "Oh, that's really boring stuff," and they kind of, well, is that my fault? Oh, Matthew, he's the one that is. Except in Matthew's case, it would be probably much more engaging. But anyway, a lot of what we know of as Aristotle's writing is really the reflections of his students later. So don't blame him if some of it seems like it's a little bit difficult. All right, what are the other classes? The second class of writings that we have from Aristotle are called theoretic science. Theoretic. He calls it theoretic because in some ways these sciences must be formulated to a high degree based on theoretical models, not direct observation, but kind of extrapolating from your observations. Here are the subjects that come under the heading of theoretic science. Physics. Mathematics. Metaphysics. Biology. Psychology. And anthropology. Okay, check your list one more time. Physics, mathematics, metaphysics, biology, psychology, anthropology. I have to say, every time I think about that, I'm somewhat stunned. Aristotle really wanted to say it all, I mean, that is kind of an astonishing thought, isn't it? He wanted to actually say it all. He wanted to give the definitive treatment of every subject. I mean, if you were to say to him, what was your major in college, he'd look at you like you were, your major. You major in everything. Everything is your major. Some people are a double major. I've even heard of triple majors, but he was a what? Tuto major. He was majored in everything, Anyway, those are the theoretic sciences. He felt that all of those required a high degree of theoretical modeling in order to explain them, and so that's why they have that. The next set were called the practical sciences. There's only two of these. Ethics and politics. And of course, last year in civics, we read quite a bit of politics. Have you read ethics in any class? Has that come up? I don't know that it would have. You had an ethics class, but we didn't read ethics. We didn't read... his ethics are called the Nicomachean Ethics. I won't test you on that, but you might make a little note of it. The last class of writings are called the poetic poetic science. There's only two of these. One of them is poetry, and the other is what? What's the only one that you think has to be on the list? You haven't seen it yet, so it must be here, and it must be, Ben? Rhetoric. In case you're wondering, we are not going to cover all of this, or even a tiny little fraction of it. This is all of our discussions are basically going to be connected with either the organon or a little bit of theoretic science, but mostly his philosophy, his metaphysics. Yes.
Would he classify literature as a subcategory of poetry?
I suppose he would. Yeah. I don't know that he would know the term literature as we use it, but I think he would include it as poetry. That's probably just what he would call it. Yeah. And keep in mind that the writings in Greece to that point had been more or less poetic. Homer, Hesiod, the poetic tradition. All right. So far, so good? Making sense? Questions? I'm going to kind of step to a new little topic here, but okay? All right. I want to do a little bit then with, you've all got this, by the way. So now it's gone forever till you see it on the test. Let us start with a bit of his metaphysics. Remember, this had been the great quest of the pre-Socratics. What is ultimate reality? Thales, of course, said ultimate reality was. Nicole, his answer was water. Others said it was different things. Heraclitus said it was just change itself. Parmenides said it was being. You have all of this conversation going on. And finally, Plato comes along and he says ultimate reality is to be found where? Where would we find it, Caleb? If we're looking for ultimate reality and we are a Platonist, where do we go to find it? If we're following Plato, ultimate reality is where?
In God.
Well, not quite in God, but you're on the right track. It is where?
In the world of forms.
In the world of forms. It's upstairs. Remember Raphael's finger pointing up? That's where it is. The ultimate reality, chairness. That's where. All right. Aristotle asked the question, where do we find this that the Greek quest has sought? That is ultimate reality. Where do we find it? And Aristotle, first of all, goes through this whole huge critique of all the prior thinkers. If you ever want to be noted as a great thinker, then one of the things you have to do is go through and write major treatises on why everybody else was wrong. You got to do it. So yeah, and it's harder for you than for Aristotle, because Aristotle only had, a couple of hundred years of Greek. You've got, several thousand years you have to go through and say, these guys were wrong, that guy was wrong, Aristotle's wrong, Plato's wrong, Marx was wrong, Nietzsche's wrong, wrong, and now Dimmel is right, and so you can entitle your book that. Dimmel is right, and it'll sell 4 or 5 copies to your mom, and there you are. So but never hurts to try. So anyway, that's what Aristotle does. He goes through, talks about Thales was wrong, and interestingly, and this is important to know, a lot of what we know about all these guys, all these pre-Socratics, we know from Aristotle. We're very grateful that Aristotle talked about why these guys are wrong, because if he hadn't said it, we would know virtually nothing about them. They didn't leave writings, you see. So Aristotle, bless his heart, gives us this wonderful catalog of all these great prior thinkers, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and it's a very even-handed treatment. He doesn't attack them first. He just reports, Here's what Thales said. Here were his arguments. Here's, the reason we should be taking him seriously, but here's where he really missed it. And then he goes to what? Anaximander, Anaximenes, Anaxagoras, all the way down, Xenophanes, Empedocles. Some of these guys we know traces of their thought from other sources, but most of it comes from Aristotle. So we're grateful to Aristotle. He gave us basically the first 2 weeks of our course, right there. We do have Plato on Plato's own writings, so we don't have to go through Aristotle to get to Plato, but Aristotle also goes through and talks about why Plato was wrong. But he's very deferential, gives him a lot of credit. But the thing that Aristotle seizes on, please try to get this. I know now we're in the last 4 minutes and the brain gets a little mushy, but here is what Aristotle attacked. He didn't like those two worlds. For him, it didn't make sense that you've got two worlds, and down here is the physical and up here is the metaphysical. He didn't like that there's this line that separates them. He didn't like that world is somewhere out there where I can never quite experience it directly. I have to sort of speculate my way to it. Or as Plato says, remember it. Well, Aristotle feels like that's a little bit mushy. Just, Plato uses words like, here's a chair. Okay? How do I know it's a chair? Because there's this perfect chair, chairness, and then Plato says something like this. And this individual chair participates in chairness. Okay, that's Plato. Aristotle goes, what does participates mean? What does that mean? How do you participate in chairness? What's happening here that connects that chair to that chair? Aristotle isn't like that, you see. He wants this chair somehow to be here so he can look at both of them at the same time at least. But he doesn't like this sort of distant, hypothetical, sort of unreal, ultimate real world of the ideals and this kind of squishy language that Plato uses. Imitation. The copy imitates the ideal. Aristotle goes. See, he's this worldly. He's Mr. Dijkstra. You show Mr. Dijkstra a grasshopper, he doesn't say, wow, that grasshopper participates in grasshopperness, the essence of grasshopper, and then he goes, no, Mr. Dijkstra wants to dissect that particular grasshopper. He wants to see what's going on in that grasshopper. He's an individualist, the particularist, 4 fingers in this world, not 1 finger in a world he's never seen. Does that make sense? And so that's going to be the constant emphasis you'll find in Aristotle. So he critiques all these people, and included among them is his great master Plato, and he critiques him really at the use of language. He feels that Plato uses imprecise language to get over his ideas. All right, questions?
Was Aristotle a little bit more spurned on to completely go against Plato's theory because he was probably mad at him?
I don't think so. He was a little miffed that Plato didn't give the school to him, but I don't think that factored into his broader philosophy. I think this was really... Remember, his dad was a doctor. He kind of grew up with a more scientific outlook. I can see where Aristotle was just shaped already by a more scientific approach to things than Plato would have been. Any other comments, questions in the last 30 seconds? So far, so good? Kind of makes sense? Arrivederci.